Hello guys, and welcome back to my video. So in this video we are going to continue with our job board application. So we'll be implementing the backend that we developed in our previous series with Node.js, Express, and MongoDB, right? We'll be implementing it in Flutter, and then we are going to be using Riverpod as our state management package. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to give you an overview of the overall application. So at first, I'm just going to log into the application. Okay, so what's going on here is that I'm getting an error because of rest limiting. So I'll just make some adjustment on my backend. Do is I'll log in to the application, and then I'll just give you an overview of how the application works, right? So as you can see, I've logged in into the application, right? We have these categories, vacancy categories, as you can see. We have vacancies on software engineer. Here we don't have vacancies. And the other thing about it is you can actually search for vacancies, right? Full text search, as you can see, cross-platform, right? So, for example, also if I search for example, DevOps positions, you can see displaying DevOps positions, right? And then if you clear, you can see it will now bring all the vacancies, right? And you can also see this is the vacancy details right here. And we can also implement pagination, as you can see. As you can see, when we reach the end, more vacancies are loaded, right? So we are just paginating our data from our backend, right? And then you can also see your applications here. You can see pending applications, and then accepted applications and applications that were rejected. And you can also see the applications that were added to favorites, right? And then you can also see the user's profile here, and you can also edit. And then the user resume, right? You can actually add your resume with the title right here, right? And you can see from the user resume, we can also view the user resume here. All right. And also the good thing about this application is you can also send applications, right? As you can see, we select our resume and then we send the resume. As you can see, application sent, as you can see, application sent, and then we can go back to more applications, right? Okay, so overview, that's how the application works in a nutshell. So without wasting much of the time, let's dive into our code, right? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to set up our folder structure, right? So the first thing that we need is the config folder, right? So inside this config folder, I'm just going to create a file called config.dat, right? So basically what I'm just going to do for this config.dat file, I'm just going to copy the code from my GitHub repository. Then I'm just going to paste it here, right? So basically this is like our base URL for our backend, right? On Android, this is for Android, and then this is for iOS. And then if you're using web, we are going to use this one, right? And then these are URL endpoints on our backend. You can see from registering the user, logging user, refresh token, getting users, categories, vacancies, companies, resume, applications, right? And then favorites. Okay, so that's it with the config file right here, right? So the next folder that we need is the core, right? It's the core folder right here. So what we need here, I'm just going to create a file for type definitions, right? So basically what I'm just going to do is I'm going to define a type definition future either of type T, which is going to be equal to a future, and then either, and then up failure, and then type T also. And then we need also to define a type definition for a future that's going to return nothing. So for a void function. So it is going to be future either of type void, right? Like this. So now what we need to do is we need to import either from the fp.package. So what I've done here, if you go inside our pubspec.yaml file, I've already installed the dependencies, right? So what you can basically do is go to my GitHub repository in the description. Just copy this and then just paste them, right? Right. So also need this one to tell us if there's a failure from our API. So now inside our folder, let's create a utils folder, right? So inside our utils folder, let's define failure.dat. So let's create a file. Let's create a class called failure. So this file is just going to display errors from our backend, right? String message and then failure, and then required this. And then we just need to override this class. And then string to string and then it's just going to return this string of type message, right? So also the other thing that we also need to do, we also need to create like a loader class. So this loader class, basically what's going to do is just going to return a circular progress indicator when you are loading data from our API, right? So we are going to use it later in our videos, right? In our video, later in this video. So it's going to take in a child and then circular progress indicator. And then we are going to give it a color, a background color, colors.black. And then We're going to give it also a color of white. All right, so that's it for loader. And also need to create another file for displaying our error text, right? In case if there's an error from our backend. So let's create a stateless widget. Error text, and then it's going to take in a string of type error. And then basically what just do is get rid of the constant, and then we can pass in this error to our constructor, right? It's supposed to be this dot error, and then simply going to return center child text, and then we just going to pass in the error on our text. Okay, so now that we are done with this, now let's move on to creating like another folder. So we are going to use a feature based folder structure. So I'm going to define this features, right? So the first feature that we are going to be working on is the auth, the authentication feature. So the authentication feature is going to have a repository. So the repository is going to communicate with our backend and then the controller. So the controller class, what it does basically is going to act as a mediator between our user interface and then the repository, right? Because we don't want business logic to be passed on to our user interface. It makes our application messy and also makes it difficult for testing. Okay, and then we also need screens that will be like our user interface, and then we also need widgets. Okay, so this is the feature that we are going to work on first, right? So basically what we can do is I'm just going to pull up my Figma here, and then I'm just going to show you the user interface for authentication. So this is going to be the register user interface. This is going to be the login interface, right? So as you can see, we have this text input for email, text input for password, login button, and it's almost similar on the sign up screen, right? So this is the user interface that we are going to be implementing, right, from Figma into our Flutter application, right? So now let's go back to our application, right? And then let's create the auth repository class. So let's create the class auth repository, right? And then on the repository also, we also need the local repository. So let's create a subfolder called local repository, right? So this local repository is the folder that we are going to use to store our tokens. So let me just pull up Postman, and then let me just show you what I'm talking about here. Okay, so this is our Postman, and then if let's say login user, right? The moment a user logs in, as you can see, we have the user token, and then we also have the refresh token, right? So we want to store the user token on our local repository inside shared preferences, and we also want to store the user ID, right? So now let's start with the local repository, right? So let's create a file called local repository, right? Okay, so this class, we need first define shared preferences, right? Shared preferences, and then shared preferences, right? So first we need to create the first function for initializing our shared preferences. So we just get the instance of our shared preferences. The next one is we need to set the token. So our token is going to be of type string. So first we need to check if our token is not equal to null, right? So if our token is not equal to null, then we just need to set this string to our token. So to store items inside shared preferences, we use key value pairs, where this is the key and then the value is going to be our token. So in this case, from our backend, the token is going to be user token. As you can see, let me pull my Postman and show you. So here, user token, right? Okay. And then the next thing is we also need to set the user ID. So the user ID is going to be of type string. So now we first need to check if that user ID is not equal to null. So if it's not equal to null, then we can now store it inside our local repository or local database, in this case, which is our shared preference, right? So we're done with setting with storing the token and then the user ID. So now the next thing that we need to do is we need to okay, so let me just remove this string ID. So the next thing now is we need to get the user truncated, right? And then to get the user token, what we're simply going to do is we're simply going to return shared preferences dot get string, and then we pass in our key. In this case, our key is going to be user token, like this, right? And then next thing is we also need to get the user ID. And then we'll simply return shared preferences, and then we pass in our key, which is going to be the user ID, right? And then let's take care of when the user logs out from our application. Because what we want to do is want to make sure that once the user logs out, we want to make sure that we clear our local database, right? Or clear our shared preferences. Okay, so let's import material that from Flutter, right? So once they're done, what we want to do is navigation dot push name okay, navigator dot push named, right? So we pass in the name of the route, which we are going to define later on, which is going to be sign in screen, right? Okay, so now that we are done logging out our user, right? What we can do now is we're taking care of our local repository. Now let's move on to the repository. Okay, so now let's move on to let's take care of the auth repository class, right? So first thing first, on the auth repository class, it's going to have two classes that it depends on, right? So the first one is going to be, it depends on the local auth repository, right? So I made a typo. It's supposed to be local auth repository, right? And then also it's going to depend on the HTTP package, right? So first thing first is we need to import the HTTP package that we are going to be using, right? So we're just going to import it as HTTP, right? And then we are simply going to pass in the auth repository like this, and then this dot repository. We are going to pass in the repository, and then we are going to pass in the client. Right. Okay, so now that we are done with this, the next thing that we need to do is we need to define the methods for logging in the user with email and password, right? So now we are going to use the either package, right? The either package. So as you can see from the either package, it takes in either a left and then a right. It takes in like two variables, right? So in this case, since we are working with APIs, we know that when we want to get data from an API, we'll either get a success or a failure, right? So we utilize this either class to make sure that if we are getting a success, we are going to define success with R, and then if we are getting a failure, we're going to define a failure with L or left, right? So now on the left side or with L, we are just going to define the failure that we defined earlier on, right? And then if it's a success, what do we want to do? If it's a success, right? For example, if I try to log into our API, let me pull Postman here, right? And then I try to log into our API, you can see that if it's a success, we are going to get this user data, right? Which I'm going to call the user model, right? So now what we need to do now to take care of this is we need to create inside our auth, we had forgotten to create the model class, right? So let's create the model class, right? So for our models, we are going to use a package called Frist, right, to create our model classes. It makes it cleaner, and also it makes it easier for us to make model classes, right? So here, what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to create a file called userModel.dat, right? And then we are simply going to import Frist package, right? So I'm just going to copy the import statement, right here. So this is the Frist package that we are going to use, right? And then the next thing that I'm going to do is we need to define parts, right? And then user model dot Frist dot dat, right? So we need to make sure we do the same thing at the user model .g .dat, like this, right? Like this, right? Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to annotate our model class with Frist at Frist, right? And then let's create an abstract class, right? Abstract class user model, right? With underscore and then $ user model. Okay, so now that we've done that, what the other thing that we need to make sure that we do is we need to define JSON serializable, right? JSON serializable, so that we make sure that our class is going to be serialized in JSON format, right? So we need to make sure that we need to define explicit to JSON. We need to make sure that it's set to true, and then any map is also set to true. So this will help us in instances whereby we'll get a JSON data from our API where it's a nested JSON data, right? So this will help us to convert JSON data to make sure that it's serializable into JSON format, right? Now we need to define a constructor, right, which is going to be a factory user model, right? user model, right? As you can see also from our backend, the user ID has an underscore, right? Underscore user ID. But in that, we cannot define underscore models, right? So what we simply have to do here is we'll simply have to map, choose a JSON key, right? A JSON key field to map our underscore data into what? Into a new format, right? For example, a JSON key, and then we make sure that the name of the JSON data that we are getting from our API is going to be underscore ID, right? So we want to map it to a new field, which is going to be ID, right? Like this, right? So now that we are done, we also need to define the username, right? Username. We also need to define the email. So let's define the email also. Email. Then the verification. Okay, so let's check if there is the verification here. Yeah, there is a verification. We also need to define the phone. And then first name, last name, and then also user type. And then also the user token. And then we also need to define the profile image. And then also the refresh token. Okay, now that we are done, we need to create another, we need to make sure that we set our constructor to underscore user model. Okay, now that we are done, we also need to create another method, which is a user model from JSON. And then takes on a map, string dynamic JSON, right? And then we are simply going to set it to underscore user model from JSON, right? Right. Since we are done with that, and then the next thing that we also need to do here is we need to make sure that, okay, so that the next thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that since we are getting the user profile from our backend, but the user profile only works if it's coming from an HTTPS, right? Otherwise we'll get an error. So let's create an extension class. So extension user extension want it to be extended on the user model, right? So basically what's going to do, so it's supposed to be outside the user model class, right? Like this. And then let's create a string, a get method. So we'll just call it full profile image path. which is set to app config.full image URL .toString. Right. Okay, so now that we're done, like to generate like our model classes, right? We use the .run build runner build, right? So now, as you can see, now we have these model classes that we generated for us, right? So as you can see, use a model from, okay, it's supposed to be caps M, right? Use a model from JSON, right? So this one is supposed to be a capital J from JSON, right? So let's regenerate again. As you can see, now our user model is now in place, right? So let's go back to our auth repository here. So what I was saying was that if we have a failure, we're going to get a failure. If we don't have success with our request, we are going to get a failure. If we are successful, our API is going to return the user model, right? Is going to return the user model. And then our method is going to take in 2 parameters, right? So the first parameter is going to be the email. The second parameter is going to be a password. Right. So this is going to be an async function right there. Right. Right. So now what we need to do is we need to create a request header, right? So it's going to be a map of string, and then request headers. Okay. So accept the data that we are going, our backend is going to accept is going to be application/JSON, right? And then the content, our content type, is going to be application JSON, right? Like this. All right, so let's make sure that we import future either. Okay. And then we need to define the URL, right? So URL is going to be URI.http, right? So first we need to pass in the base URL, which is going to be appconfig.base URL. Then we need to pass in the route, right? So the route is going to be appconfig.login URL, like this, right? And then what we need is we need to get a response from the API. So the response from the API is going to come from client. It's going to come when we post our data to our API, right? So for the headers, we are going to pass in the request headers, right? And then for the body, now the body for our API. The body for our API, we're going to pass in JSON encode, right? And then we are going to pass in email, and then password. Then we are simply going to pass in the password, right? So first we need to pass in the URL, right? Okay. And then we need the data from our API. So our data is going to come from JSON encode, right? JSON encode response web body. Right. So now that we're done, what we do now is we need to create a try-catch block, right? We need to create a try-catch block so that if there are any errors, we'll catch those errors, right? So the first thing that we are going to do is we are going to check from our response. If the response.status code is equal to 200, that means that everything went well. Or response.status code is equal to 201, right? We are going to check if everything went well. What we are simply going to do now is if everything went well, right, what we simply need to do is, so this, we need to change this to local auth repository, right? Okay, we need to change this to local auth repository right there. So what we simply need to do here is local auth repository dot set user ID. So we are setting the user ID. We are storing the user's ID into our local storage, which is our shared preferences, right? Which is going to be data. And then as you can remember from our API, it's going to be underscore ID, right? It's going to be underscore ID. So it's saying that string can be assigned to the parameter int. So I think we made a mistake here. Set token and then set user ID. So let's go back to our local auth repository. Our data type is the string. Yeah, it's also a string. Set user ID string. I don't know why it's saying it's a. Okay, let's do the same for the token. Set token, and then token is going to come from our data. Okay, so the reason why we are getting this error is because we use JSON encode instead. It's supposed to be decoded, right? Because when we are getting a response from our API, we need to decode that JSON response. But when we are sending it to our API, we need to encode it, right? As you can see here in the body, we are sending it to our API. That's why we are encoding it to JSON. But when we are getting a response, we need to decode it, right? That's why you see now we are no longer getting any errors, right? So now let's move on to the let's move on to the next step, right? Which is once we are done with this, we can also store our refresh. We can also store our refresh token, but I'm just going to leave it like that now. Once we get a success, we are going to return right to remember from our, this is going to be our right, right? and then it's going to have like a user model dot from JSON, right? From JSON, we then pass in the data from our JSON, right? So let's just make sure that here we just import fp.dat, right? And then else, if there's an error, right? If there's an error, or if we don't get a 200 status code or a 201 status code, what we're simply going to do is we are simply going to return app failure, right? A left app failure. And then we are simply going to return app failure with a JSON response, which is going to be message, right? So we need a required position. We need a required argument here. I think it's going to be message, right? And then the message is going to come from our data, and then from our message, right? And then after this, inside our trackage block, right, if there's any error, then we just need to simply catch the error. Then we simply need to catch the error, right? So to catch the error, we are simply going to return left and then app failure. And then the message is going to be e.toString, error.toString, right? Okay. So now that we are done with this method right here, it's saying that it's expecting another closing tag. I don't know why. Okay, it's because we forgot login. We forgot the name of the function, right? So it's going to be login with email and password, right? So that's the name of our function, right? So now we need to define another function, which is going to be which is going to be sign up with email and password. So let's just copy this format right here. Let's paste it below, right? And then I'm just going to change this from email to sign up. Sign up with email and password. That's going to take in our email, and then we also need a username. Username, and then we simply just pass in the username, right? And then we simply pass in the username. Then I'm simply going to get rid of this right here, because we don't need to store any tokens, right? And then after this, I think everything is okay for the sign up with email and password, right? The function sign up with email and password, everything is okay. Now that we are done with our repository, right? So inside our repository, we define two functions right here. We have the login with email and password, which takes in email and our password as a parameter, right? And then we define the function as a feature of type either. So the either allows us to make sure that we have two states or two responses that we can get from an API. We can either get a failure, which we are going to represent with a failure, and then we can get the user data, which we are going to represent with the user model right there, right? So now that we are done, now we are going to be using Riverpod, right, as our state management package, and also you're going to use it as our dependency injection package, right? So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to create a repository provider, right? Auth repository provider, which is going to be equal to provider. Our provider is going to take in a reference or ref right? And then it's going to just simply going to return auth repository. Right, as you can see, we need the local auth repository and we also need the client, right? So inside our local auth repository, let's go back to our local auth repository, right? So let's also create another local auth repository provider, right? Which is going equal to our provider, and then checks in the reference, and then it's simply going to return our local auth repository, right? It's simply going to return our local auth repository right there. Okay, so now that we are done with it, then we need a HTTP client, right? We also need the HTTP client. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to create a folder inside our lib folders. I'm just going to name it providers, right? And then I'm just going to create a file called providers.dat, right? So now I'm simply going to define our HTTP provider, right? Which is going to equal to a provider, and then it's going to take in a reference. So let's make sure that we simply import Flutter Job Board, right? And then it's going to simply return the initialize our HTTP.client, right? So it's going to just initialize our instance for our HTTP package, right? So now let's just import the HTTP package with our prefix as HTTP, right? So now that we are done with that, now we can move on to our auth repository, right? So our auth repository class, as you can see, our auth repository class has two dependencies that it depends on. It depends on the local auth repository and the HTTP client, right? So what we simply need to do is we need to inject these dependencies inside here, right? So what do we do with our local auth repository, right? As you can see, this is our local auth repository. For us to inject an instance of our local auth repository class inside our auth repository, as you can see, we already have the auth repository provider, right? Local auth repository provider, right? So what we can simply do is we simply have to use reference.watch from reference.watch, and then we simply call out our local auth repository provider, right? And then we do the same for our HTTP reference.watch there, and then HTTP provider, right? HTTP provider, right? And then we simply return our HTTP provider right there, right? So now that we now have our auth repository provider and we have injected these dependencies right here, now it's time we move on to our controller, right? So if you still remember, I said the controller class is responsible for mediating between the repository class and our user interface, right? So what I'm simply going to do here, I'm simply going to create a class called auth controller, right? Auth controller.dat, right? So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to create a class called auth controller. So I'm simply going to create a class called class auth controller. And then this class is going to extend, we are simply going to extend refer port async notify. Right, we are simply going to extend async notify, which is going to take in an async value of type void. Right. So let's make sure that we import Flutter Job Board, right? Let's import Flutter Job Board, right? So this is the async notifier class. If you still remember, we used to use the state notifier, but now it's been deprecated, right? Now we are using the async notifier class. So think of this as a view model class, right? Which is a class that allow us to, it watches states, right? State changes from our user interface. And then from those state changes, then make sure that it updates the data. It updates our user interface according to the state change, right? And according to the data from our API, right? So this is the async notifier class right there. So if you don't understand about Riverboard, I have a separate video where I talked about Riverboard providers and these classes, right? So now what we need to do on the async notifier, the first thing that we need to do is we need to create an override function, right? We need to create an override function, right? And then after creating an override function, we need to create an async value of type void, right? An async value of type, a method, a build method of type async value, right? And then in that build method, that's when we can like initialize all our variables, right? So here we have two dependencies that we need. We also need the auth repository, right? We need the auth repository, going to be our auth repository class, right? So we are simply going to initialize the auth repository inside our build function, right? Then we are simply going to watch what the auth repository provider right there, right? Okay, so now that we are done with our build function, right? Now we need to make sure that it returns, we return an async value data. So the data is simply going to be null there, right? And then what we need to do here is we need to create a method future void, and the method is going to be login with email and password, right? And then it's going to be an async method, right? The method is going to check in string type email string password. And then build context, and then context, right? And then what we simply need to do is we need to create a variable user, which is going to be equal to auth repository dot login with email and password, right? And then since we defined, we used either from our previous functions that we created, login function, and also the sign in with user and password function, what we can simply do is we can simply create a switch statement which takes in the user, right? And then what it's simply going to do is, so here just make sure that we have an await function right there, switch user, and then when it's going to return, which is going to return left, right? So left, remember, we use the left when we get an error from our API, right? So we are going to set that value to, if there's an error, what we're simply going to do is we need to just show a snake bar. Show snake bar. And then we pass in the context, then the message like this. Okay. So now that we are done, now that we need to create a show snake bar function, right? So let's go inside our utils folder, right? Let's create a file called util.dat, right? So this file is going to be show show snake bar, text in build context, and then it's going to take in the text. And then the snake bar is going to come from scaffold messenger. And then we need to pass in the context. And then we need to hide the current snake bar. And then after that, we need to show the snake bar. And then we are going to pass in the snake bar. And then the content is going to be of type text. And then we pass in the text, and then the color is going to be, the background color is going to, let's make sure that it's orange. All right. So now we are done with now that we are done with this snake bar, right? Let's go inside our auth repository, and then let's make sure that we just import the snake bar, right? So inside our auth controller, right? And then the next thing that we simply need to do here, so this is supposed to be an arrow function, right? And then the next thing that we need to do here is we need to return a right, and then value, and then we assign it to R, and then simply going to navigator dot push named, right? And then we are simply going to redirect the user to our main screen. Okay. All right. So we are done with this. Now let's move on to, let's also move on to register with email and password, right? So we are simply going to sign in with email and sign up with email and password. We are simply going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to change the function name, right? And then here it's going to take in a username, right? And then sign up with email and password, and then we need to pass in the username, right? And then after this successful, we want to redirect the user to our sign in screen. Okay, so now basically we are done with our auth controller, right? So what we simply need to do is we simply need to create a auth controller provider, right? So that we'll be able to access the auth controller inside our user interface, right? Auth controller provider, which is equal to async notifier provider, right? Async notifier provider, which is going to take in auth controller, and then an async value type void, and then simply have to return auth controller .new, the instance of the auth controller, right? So now we are done with the auth controller. Now we need to move on to our user interface and make sure that we implement our user interface from Figma. Okay, so now we are moving on to our user interface, right? So if we go back to our Figma, as you can see, this is going to be our welcomes, our sign up screen, and then this is going to be our login screen, right? So if I also pull out like our mobile application, let me just log out. As you can see, we have this rounded border here, rounded border on the text input. On our text input field, right, we have this rounded border here. So let's take care of it, right? So what we simply have to do is, let's go inside our utils folder, right? Inside our utils folder, I'm just going to create a file called custom text field, right? Custom text field .dat, right? And then it's going to be a setless widget, which I'm going to call custom text field. Okay. Right, so basically it's going to take in, we're going to have two input parameters. First is going to be the hint text, right? And then the second one is going to be the label, which is going to be of type widget. And then label. Okay. So now let's pass it inside our constructor. Okay, so now what we need to do here is we need to return a text form field. Right, so we need to return a text form field, and then the first thing that we need to do is we need to pass in a controller, right? So we forgot also a controller, right? So text editing controller. So we need to pass it inside our constructor here. So it must be required, right? It's a requirement. So just make sure that it's required, right? So on the controller, we just pass in the controller that we defined above, right? And then the next thing is we need to decorate our text form field, right? So to decorate it, we use the input decoration, right? And then the first thing is we need a fill color, right? So the fill color is going to be colors.white. So as you can see, this is the fill color. So if I pull out my emulator here, this is the fill color, right? So let's make sure that the fill color is white. And then we also need the hover color. So the hover color is going to be colors.black, right? The hover color is going to be colors.black. And then field parameter, just make sure that we set this to true. And then the hint text will simply pass the hint that we defined. Hint text. Okay. And then now we also need content padding there, right? We need to apply padding to our text form field, right? So to do that, we just make sure that we use edge insets dot symmetric, right? Dot symmetric. So one padding from the vertical axis, right? That means from the top, 25 from the top, and then from the edges or horizontal, we want it to be 8, right? So now we are done with content padding, right? Now what we need is the hint style, right? We need to define the hint style, right? So define the hint style, it's going to be text style, right? Text style, and then what we need is we need to pass in the color. The color is going to be colors.black, right? And then also the font weight, right? Which is going to be font weight dot bold, right? And then the font size, which is going to be 20, right? And then now that we are done with this, now we need to define the border, right? So the border is going to be input border.none. Input border.none, right? Now that we are done with the input border, now we need to define the enabled border, right? So the enabled border is the one that now we need to define, right? So that this shows a border when our text form field is enabled. That means if a user is typing in something, right? So it's going to be an outline border, outline input border, right? And then we need to define the border side, right? We need to find the border side, and then the color is going to be black. And then we need to find the width, which is going to be 3, right? And then we also need to define the border radius. So the border radius is going to be border radius to circular, right? And then we'll make sure that it's 20, right? Well, we'll make sure that it's 10, right? And then the other thing that we need is the focus border, so that when user is focused on the on our text form field, right? So the focus border is going to also be an outline input border, right? And then we need to make sure that we give it a border side, right? And then border side, and then we need to make sure that the color is not black. And then width, we need to make sure that the width is 3, right? And then we also need to also give it like a border radius, right? And then so our border radius is going to be border radius dot circular, and then also need to make sure that it's 10, right? So now we are done with our text form field, right? So this is going to be our text form field, right? So now basically what we are going to do now is let's go inside our auth folder, inside our screen, and then let's define our sign in screen, right? So let's make sure that it's a stateful widget, and then make sure it's going to be sign in screen, right? And then what we need to do here is we need to find an email controller. Which is going to be a text editing controller. And then we also need to also define a password control. And then it's also going to be a text editing controller. Okay, right. And then the other thing is we need to define a boolean for n is check if a process is an async process, right? Is async core process. Which is going to be equal to false. Right, and then the next thing that we need to do is we need to define our form key, right? So let's make sure that static final. Let's define the global key. which is going to be of type form state, right? So this is going to just watch any state changes in our form. Which is equal to a global key, right? And then we simply like this, right? And then the next thing that we need to do here is we need to define a function for validating our data, right? So to do that, we'll create a Boolean function called validate and save, right? And then we need to define the form. In this case, the form is going to be equal to our form key dot current state, right? So we need to make sure that it's equal to the current state, right? Like this, right? And then we are going to check if the form, which is equal to the form state dot validate, right? We are going to check, we are going to validate, right? So that means that it's valid. We are going to save any changes, right? And then we are just simply going to return true. Else we are just going to return false. Okay, so now that we are done with this, now what we need to do is when we are dealing with controllers, right, you need to make sure that you dispose them once they are no longer used, right? So that it doesn't cause our UI to crash, right? So now what we can simply do is define the email controller dot dispose, right? Once we are done with it, we just dispose it. Same goes with the password controller, right? Dispose, right? Like this, right? So now what you're simply going to do is, as you can see from our app, from let me pull Figma, you can see that we have this background color right here, right? So basically what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to create a color inside our utils class. So let's create a file called color.dat. And then let's paste it inside, right? So let's paste the background color. This is background color for our application right there, right? This is the background color for our application. So what we are simply going to do is that if we go inside our main.dat file, right? So inside our theme data, right? So let's just get rid of this, right? So let's change the color scheme, right, to color scheme dot light, right? And then we define the surface, which is going to be the app colors dot background color, right? So that we don't have to manually put the background color of every screen in our application, right? So now that we are done, let's go back to our sign-in screen, and then let's start building, right? So the first thing is we need to return a scaffold, right? A scaffold, and then we need an app bar, and then an app bar. So we are getting an error because our scaffold is still constant, right? So basically what we need an elevation of 0, and then automatically leading implying we'll set it to false. So this means that if you click a back button, it will show us a back button, but we don't want to show a back button on this user interface. So we just make sure that we set automatically imply leading to false, right? And then let's define the body of our screen, right? In this case, the body of our screen is going to be a single child scroll view. It's going to be a single child scroll view, and then the child is going to be a column. And then let's define the children, right? And then let's create a center widget with the child. The child is going to be of type text. And then let's set it to welcome. sign in, right? And then let's set the style to, okay, so we need to style this text, right? So let's style it using text style. And then if we go to our Figma, you can see this is the text right here. You can see that font size is 32 and then also bold, right? The font weight is bold. So let's go back. So let's make sure that the font size, let's make sure that the font size is 32 and then the font weight is bold. Okay, so font weight dot bold, right? So now that we are done with this, we need also the we need a spacing, right? As you can see from our Figma, if we go to our Figma design right here, you can see like we have this spacing right here. So I'm not going to include this. Let's find a dream job. We are just going to skip it and then we are going to put our text form field there. Okay, so let's go back to our VS Code, right? So size box, let's just make sure that the height is something like 50, right? The height is something like 50. And then after this, what we need is a form, right? So this form, we need to provide a key. So this key is going to be our form key, right? Our form key. So it's just going to monitor the state of our form, right? And then the child is going to be a column. Let's make sure it's a column widget, right? So a column widget has multiple child. So we use a children widget to make sure that there are multiple child, right? And then what we need is now we need our custom text view that we created. If you still remember, if we go into our utils folder, we created a custom text view, right? So let's just go there and then let's rename it. So it's custom text field, right? All right, so here it's going to be custom text field, right? And then let's make sure that we wrap this custom text field with a padding widget, right? So let's make sure that we wrap it with a padding widget. In this case, the controller in our case is going to be an email controller, right? It's going to be an email controller, and then the hint text is going to be enter email. Okay, so we also need a spacing between these text form fields, right? So we're also going to use the size box. So let's make sure that the height here is 15, right? So now that we are done with this one, let's just copy this text form field here and then let's just paste it below, right? And then let's change this to enter your password. Okay, so this is supposed to be a password controller. So let's change it to password controller, right? And then now we need to work on the elevated button, right? We need to work on the button, this button right here. So if we go to this button here, the login button right there. Okay, so basically what we are going to do is let's go here below our text form field, and then what we need is an elevated button, right? So an elevated button. So on pressed, it takes in a method that will display, that will process like when we press, and then the text for this is going to be login, right? So let's make sure the text is login, right? So the text is supposed to be sign in, okay? Okay, like this, right? And then let's make sure that we style it also. Check style, and then make sure that the color is white. And then the font size is 20. and then also the font weight. The font weight, make sure that the font weight is font weight.bold, right? All right, so now that we are done with this, okay. Now that we are done with this, we need to style this. We need to style this elevated button, right? So basically what I'm just going to do here, I'm going to use a style property, right? And then we just use an elevated button. Elevated button dot style from, right? And then the background color is going to be black. And then let's make sure that we give it a shape, right? So the shape is going to be rounded rectangular box. A rounded rectangular border, right? And then we give it like a border radius. And then the border radius is going to be border radius. And border radius dot circular, and then make sure it's 20, right? Like this, right? So now that we are done with this, so what we simply have to do is make sure that we need to consume our Riverboard provider. So here, for you to consume Riverboard providers, right, inside the stateful widget, we'll just use we just change this from a stateful widget to consumer stateful widget, and then make sure you change this from state to consumer state, right? And then also make sure you also change this to consumer state, right? And then after this, what you basically need to do is import Flutter Riverboard, right? So once you've done that, what we simply need to do, if we are creating Riverboard providers inside buttons, right? What you basically need to do is if we are going to check if validated and save, right? If validated and save, what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to hit our auth controller provider dot notify, right? And then we are simply going to dot login with email and password. And then the email is going to be email controller dot text. And then the password is going to be password controller dot text. Text, right? And then after this, we are simply done with our login screen, right? And then for the sign up screen, or the register screen, it's almost similar. So what we simply need to do here is I'm simply going to copy everything here. Right, so let me copy everything here, and then inside our screens, let's create another called register screen. So we are supposed to create a file. It's supposed to be register screen.dat, like this, right? Register screen.dat, and then I'm simply going to paste it here, and then I'm simply going to change this to register screen, right? And then I'm simply going to change this again to register screen, right? And then simply going to change this again. And then let's change this also to register. And then let's change all right, so that we are done with this. Now what we need here is another controller. So I'm simply going to copy this here, right here, and then I'm simply going to paste it here, and then I'm going to change it to username controller, right? Username controller, and then inside our dispose function, we are simply going to dispose it. Username controller dot dispose, right? All right, so now that we are done, And then we also need the username text form field. So I'm simply going to copy this right here, copy. And then I'm simply going to paste it here. And then you enter your username, right? And then let's change this from password to username control. All right, so let's go inside our elevated button and let's change the text from sign in to register. And then here, what we simply need to do here is okay, dot sign up with email and password, right? And then email controller dot text, and then username controller dot text. And then password controller dot text. All right, so now we are done with this. Well, there's one thing that we forgot to do is we need a text, right, after this elevated button, right? So I'll simply copy this size box right here after this elevated button. So after our elevated button right here, I'm simply going to paste our size box because we need some spacing. And then already this text here, which are going to say like already have an account. Already have an account, and then sign in, right? And then style, then text style, and then make sure that the color is black. And then the font size is 20. And then make sure that the font weight is 200. Okay, so let's make sure the font weight is 600, like this, right? All right, so now that we are done with this, it's supposed to also, let's make sure that it's centered, right? So I'm just going to wrap it with the center widget. And also we need to wrap it with a gesture detector, right? So that when the user clicks on this text, it's supposed to respond to the gesture, right? So on the gesture detector widget, once our text is, the user taps on our text, what we want to do is we want to take them back to our sign-in screen, right? So I'll just use navigator dot push named, right? Navigator dot push named, and then the route is going to be, we're just going to redirect them to our initial route, right? So basically now what I'll simply do is I'll simply copy the size box and our gesture detector, right? The size box and our gesture detector, because we didn't do it right in our sign-in screen, right? So yeah, after our elevated button, let's just paste it there, and then so here we just have to change it like from already have an account to don't have an account register, right? Right, and then it's supposed to direct out to our register screen, right? Supposed to direct us to our register screen, right? Now that we are done with this. So now that we have taken care of the register and then sign-in screen, now the main task now lies in our main.dat file, right? Because inside our main.dat file, we need to make some modifications there so that we need to write a logic so that when the user logs in, it will take us to our main screen, right? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a widget, right, which we are going to call default home, right? So default home. So the default home at first is going to be the sign-in screen, right? Right. So inside our here, we need to change our main method into an async main method, right? And then the first thing that we need to do here is we need to initialize widgets Flutter binding, right? So what this does is that it binds for application based on widgets framework, right? So it binds the framework to the Flutter engine, right? Something like that, right? And then after this, we need a container for providers, right? So let's define a container for providers, which is equal to provider container, right? Which is equal to provider container from our riverboard, right? So this is just an object that stores the state of providers, right? And allows us to modify the behavior of a specific provider, right? And then what we need to do is for our application to work, we need to wrap the root widget of our application, that is my app, right? We need to wrap it with a widget, right? In this case, the widget is going to be uncontrolled provider scope, right? We need to wrap it with an uncontrolled provider scope, and then uncontrolled provider scope also needs to take in a container, right? And then the container is going to be our container provider that we defined, right? And then after this, what we need to do is from our container provider, right, we need to read a provider that we want to read, right? In this case, we want to read the local repository provider, right? That is the provider that we are going to read, and then we are going to initialize it, right? If you still remember, we have the init function, right? So the init function, what basically does, it initializes our shared preferences, because you need to initialize the shared preferences inside our root, inside our main function, right? So that's basically what we are doing here, right? And then now what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to create a variable called result, right? This result is equals to container, right? Dot read. We are going to read also the local auth repository, right? And then local auth repository provider dot, and then we want to get the user token, right? We want to get the user token, right? From our local auth repository, right? Since we have gotten now the auth token from our local auth repository, what we simply need to do is we need to write some logic, right? So the first logic that we're going to write is we are going to check if the result is not equal to null, right? So we are going to check if our user has a user token, right? That means if they have a user token, that means that they are logged into our application, right? But if they don't, that means that they are not logged into our application, right? Since we have a JWT token, what is simply, we are going to check if that token is not now the JWT token. If that token is not now, that means that our user is logged into our application. And then we'll now set the default one. The default one, we will now set it to what? To the main screen instead of what? Of the sign-in screen. So we'll now redirect the user to the main screen. That means that they're what? They are logged in, right? So we haven't defined the main screen yet. So inside our features, right, we have the auth. So here, what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to define the main, right? So inside our main, let's create another folder, another subfolder called screen. And then in that screen folder, let's then define the main screen, right? Main screen dot. So it's not supposed to be a folder, it's supposed to be a file, right? So let's define the file main main screen data, right? Then let's create it like so. It's going to be a setless widget, right? Then we just define its main screen right there, right? So now that we are done, let's import it, right? So now that we are done with this, so now we are now here. I'm just going to clear this title here, right here. And then another thing is we don't want to show the debug banner, so we just set it to false, right? And then what we need here is we need to remove the home screen, right? Instead of home screen, we are going to use routes, right? So for our routes, right? So our initial route, we are going to represent it with a /, right? And then we define the context, and then it's going to be, we are going to set it to our main screen, right? Main screen, right? And then define also the route for the sign in, which is going to be sign in screen. And then we are simply going to redirect to the sign in screen, right? So we forgot a comma. And then we also need a register screen, right? So just define a register screen, right? Takes in an arrow function, we takes in a context, and then we'll return our register screen. All right, so now that we are done with our application now, since we are done with our application, so first of all, we define this widget, right, which is going to the default home screen. At first, since the user is not logged in, it will redirect to our sign-in screen, right? And then we then define a container provider that's just think of it like as a container for providers, right? It stores other providers, right? And then from this container, we are going to read the local auth repository, and then we are going to initialize the local auth repository. And then we are going to get the user token, right? And then we are going to check if the user token is not equal to now, right? And then we'll then redirect the user to the main screen, right? And then for Riverport to work, we need to make sure that we wrap our parent widget, right, with the root widget with our uncontrolled provider scopes, which takes in a container, which is our container right here, and then the child, which is going to be our root widget, right? And then we then define the routes for our application right here, right? So now, since now we are done with our application, let's run our application and then let's see the results, right? So let's run it and then let's see the results. So I'm just going to simply stop the application and then I'm just going to run it again. So let me try to run it on iOS, right? Okay, so we kind of getting an error. I think it has to do with shared preferences or something like that. So I think what we can simply do is let's just try to remove the application at first. Let's delete it, right? And then let's try to reinstall it again. So I think we are currently getting an error with the local auth repository. Let me check what's causing this error. I see what's the main problem here. So this right here is supposed to be a function, right? Widget.ensure initialized, right? This one, it's supposed to be a function, right? So let's reload it. Now, as you can see now, our application is now working, but you can see now we have been redirected to our main screen, right? So let's try to remove it. Then let's see. Okay, so I think we made a typo here. Here it's supposed to be, our initial route is supposed to be default home, right? Not main screen. It's supposed to be default home, right? Since we need to validate that logic that we wrote there. And then after this, that's when we need to define main/main, right? And then it's going to take in, this function is going to take in a context, and then it's going to be main screen like this, right? All right, so now if I reload the page, you can see now it's showing us our sign-in screen. Oh, as you can see, our button is not similar to the one that we wrote. You see Figma right here. It's not similar. So, but basically what we need to do is let's go to our sign-in screen. And then we need to just wrap it with a size box, right? So let's go here to elevated button right here. We need to wrap it with the size box widget, and then we give it like a width of double dot infinity. So that means we want it to fill the whole width, and then the height is going to be like 70, right? And then we wrap it with a padding widget. We do the same for the other one, right? Yeah. So we are simply going to wrap it with a size box. Width is going to be double dot infinity, and then the height is going to be 70, right? Like this. Now, and then let's repeat it with the padding widget. So let's make sure I do the same thing. So if I reload now, you can see register. As you can see, let's try 100 gmail.com, and then I'll just put my name, and then let's just put a dummy password. It's saying user not found. So basically we made a typo here. Sign up with email and password. So let's go to our auth controller. I think we made a typo somewhere. Let's go to our auth controller and then log in with email, sign up with email and password, email, username. Let's go to our auth repository. So the reason being is we forgot to change this to register URL. So let's change it to register URL. That's why we're getting that error. So now let's try to register. Saying duplicate error. So I think we already have another username, and then let's try this one. Also now it's saying too many login attempts. I think it's because now of the rate limiting. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to change the rules on my backend, because remember the last time we had implemented rate limiting. So I'm simply going to remove it for now. Okay, and then let's do it again. So now let's try to log in. Let's share. It's 100 at gmail.com, and then share. And then I'll just put a dummy password. Show me is 100. So let me just complete it with my name here. unesu100 at gmail.com, right? Share, and then let's try it, and then okay, I think there's something wrong with our, go inside our register screen. Let's check sign up with email and password. All right, so let's try again. And then let's input our password. Say email already exists. So let's try 200. Okay, it's because the username also already exists. Let's try 200 again. So it's because something is going on with we have a duplicate key. I think something has to go. It's something in, we have a problem with our form key, right? So let me check what's going on. So it's saying that global key was detected inside our, all right, so we have duplicate, we made an error here. This is not supposed to be a global key, right? This is supposed to be a form key. So this is supposed to be a global key and then form key, and then we need to make sure here it's of type form state, right? So that we don't keep on getting those errors. Let's go back to our sign in again. Let's make sure that it's of type form state, right? All right. So now let's reload our application and then let's retry it again. So I'll just say Jonesu 300 at gmail.com. Right, so now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is our password. Okay, saying too many attempts, I think I forgot again to remove the rate limiting on the register route. So let me remove rate limit. Okay, let's try again. Okay, so let's try to sign in again. So what's going on? So the global key was, this key was, okay, so what we can simply do is, let's just copy this, right? This error right here. And then let's open ChatGPT. And then let's okay, it's because we define these global keys that are same, right? So here we'll just say register. We just say sign in key. And then let's make sure that we change here to sign in key. And then also here also. Right, so now let's reload our application and then let's try to register. Right, so we're simply going to use another dummy email again. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what's going on? Duplicate key in a widget tree. Okay, so for now I'll just disable it and then we will take care of it later. Okay. gmail.com, and then shown it so 500. Okay, now let's log in. And then let's try to log in. Okay, so let's go back to our, I think now the problem is our main dot. This one is supposed to be set to to our default home, and then if to redirect us, if this is not equal, now it must redirect her to the home screen, right? So it's saying cannot find generator for route settings main screen, right? So here we must change it to main screen, right? It's supposed to be main screen, not main. And then let's go back now. As you can see, now we are now logged in because our token is not equal to now, right? So that was it, guys, on implementing like authentication on our application. In the next video, what we are simply going to do is we are simply now going to take care working on the home page, right? We are going to be working on the home page, and then we'll start implementing other features. Thanks for watching, guys.